The dress was the color of a full moon. Sadie had spent 3 weeks sewing every stitch by herself, in the dim candlelight, after the sun went down, and the cold of the small cottage began to stiffen her fingers. It was a simple dress, without golden embroidery or imported lace like the ones the Lord's daughters wore. But it was honest. Every stitch had been placed with intention. Every seam was a promise she made to herself that this night would be different. She was 23 years old and had never entered the great hall of Ashenvale as a real guest. She had always come through the back door, with a basket of herbs in hand, or a delivery from her mother to bring to the kitchens. Daughter of a clanless healer, no noble blood, no name worth anything on the lips of the aristocracy. Sadie was the kind of woman people saw without truly seeing, greeted out of politeness and forgotten moments later. But tonight was different. Tonight, Dorian had promised. Dorian Ashvale, son of the Lord Counselor, heir to one of the oldest advisory seats in the Eastern Territories, had looked her in the eyes 2 weeks ago beneath the old oak at the edge of the forest and said the words she had been waiting to hear for nearly a year. I will stand beside you at the claiming gathering, in front of everyone. She had believed him. That was her first mistake. The claiming gathering happened only once every 4 years, when the packs of the Northern and Eastern Territories came together under one roof to honor alliances, settle disputes, and formalize bonds. It was the most important social event in the werewolf world she had grown up on the edges of, always watching from a distance, never quite belonging. For a woman without a clan, being publicly chosen by a man of Dorian's standing would have meant everything. A name, a place, a pack, a home. She had not told her mother about the promise. She had not told her closest friend Brea either, until the night before, when Brea had found her pressing the finished dress against her chest in the dark and had demanded to know why she was crying while smiling at the same time. Brea had held her hands and looked at the dress with wide, careful eyes. It's beautiful, Sadie. You made this yourself? Every stitch. Brea had gone quiet in a way that meant she had things to say but was choosing not to say them. That silence had followed Sadie all the way to the Great Hall. The hall itself was overwhelming in the way it always was when seen from the inside, rather than through a cracked service door. Stone walls rose 30 feet into shadow, lined with iron torches that threw amber light across the hanging banners of every pack in attendance. The smell hit her first, the way it always did when wolves gathered in numbers. Pine resin, wood smoke, leather, something older underneath it all, something animal and electric that had no name in human language. Long tables of dark oak ran the length of the hall, already crowded with wolves in their finest, lords and ladies of the packs, beta officers in formal tunics, alpha heirs with the particular way they held their shoulders that announced their rank before a single word was spoken. Sadie stood near the entrance for a moment, letting her eyes adjust. She had braided her dark hair with a thin ribbon she'd dyed herself. She wore no jewels because she owned none worth wearing. The dress was enough, she had told herself. The dress was everything she had. She found Dorian near the east column, laughing with 2 men she didn't recognize, a cup of spiced wine already in hand. He was handsome in the way that came easily to men who had never gone without anything. Broad jaw, easy smile, the kind of posture that only came from a lifetime of being told you were important. When he saw her, something shifted in his expression. Not warmth. Not the recognition of a man seeing the woman he had made a promise to. Something more like calculation. She walked toward him anyway, because she had spent 3 weeks on this dress, and she was not going to let a look stop her. Sadie, he said, and his voice was pleasant in the careful way of someone who was being overheard. Dorian. She stopped beside him, close enough that the 2 men he'd been speaking with glanced between them with mild curiosity. You said you would find me when I arrived. I was just about to. He smiled, and it didn't reach his eyes. You look, well, not beautiful. Not the way he had looked at her under the oak tree. Well, like a neighbor whose garden was doing fine. She felt the first thread of unease pull tight in her chest, but she held her expression steady. "Shall we find our seats?" That was when the woman appeared. She came from the direction of the high table, moving through the crowd with the ease of someone who had never needed to excuse herself to anyone. She was tall, pale, dressed in deep burgundy with silver thread at the collar, and she wore the crest of the Ashvale family on a brooch at her shoulder. Not a guest wearing it. A woman who had been given the right to wear it. Dorian's posture changed the moment he saw her. Straightened. Opened. "Mira," he said, and that was the voice Sadie had thought was hers. The woman, Mira, reached them and placed a hand on Dorian's arm with the familiarity of someone who had already been told yes. She looked at Sadie with polite, distant eyes. "Is this one of the kitchen staff?" she asked, not unkindly, just honestly, which was somehow worse. The hall did not go silent. The world did not stop. The torches kept burning, and the wolves kept drinking, and the banners kept hanging from their iron rods. But something inside Sadie's chest cracked cleanly in two, like a branch under the first real weight of winter snow. Dorian did not correct the woman. He glanced at Sadie once, and what she saw in his eyes was not cruelty. It was something more ordinary than that. It was relief. Relief that he hadn't had to say it himself. "I think there may have been a misunderstanding," he said quietly, for her ears only, leaning just slightly closer. "My family has expectations. You understand." She understood perfectly. She did not cry. She would not give him that, or the hall, or the watching eyes she could already feel beginning to collect around this small, quiet disaster, like wolves scenting something wounded. "Of course," she said. Her voice came out even. She was proud of that, afterward, for a long time. "Enjoy your evening, Dorian." She turned. The dress moved around her ankles like water. She kept her chin level, and her hands still at her sides, and she walked toward the far end of the hall where there was a side corridor that led to a courtyard, and from there to the road home. She had almost reached it when she heard the voice, not directed at her, directed at someone nearby, low and unhurried and carrying the particular weight of a man who never needed to raise his voice to be heard. "Whoever ends up with her," the voice said, with what sounded almost like quiet conviction, "will be extraordinarily lucky." She stopped walking. Not because the words were flattering, but because of the tone. It wasn't the tone of a man making polite conversation or offering empty comfort to someone nearby. It was the tone of a man stating a fact he had already decided was true. She turned, slowly. There were 3 of them standing near the stone archway to her left, and the hall seemed to give them space the way water gives space to stone. The tallest stood slightly apart from the other 2, a cup in his hand that he hadn't touched. Dark clothing with no unnecessary ornamentation. Eyes the color of winter bark, steady and unreasonably calm, fixed on her with an attention that made her feel, for the first time that evening, like someone was actually seeing her. She had never seen him before in her life, but every wolf in the hall, she realized, had gone just slightly quieter in his vicinity, and the crest on the ring he wore was one she recognized, even from this distance, the royal seal of the AlphaKing. His name moved through the hall like a current beneath still water. Sadie didn't hear it spoken aloud. She didn't need to. The way the crowd repositioned itself around those 3 figures near the archway said everything that a name could have said. Shoulders turned. Conversations lowered. Even the most powerful lords in the room, men who carried themselves like they owned the stones beneath their feet, adjusted their posture almost imperceptibly, the way tall grass bends when the wind changes direction without announcing itself. The AlphaKing of the Northern Throne had not been expected at the claiming gathering. Or perhaps he had been, and no one had told the people who mattered least, which, until approximately 4 minutes ago, had included Sadie. She stood in the space between the corridor and the hall, not quite leaving, not quite staying, caught in the particular paralysis of someone who has just had the ground shift beneath them without warning. The dress that had felt like armor an hour ago now felt like exactly what it was. Fabric she had cut and sewn alone in a cold room, hoping it would be enough. The man with the winter bark eyes was still looking at her. Not with the hunger some men used as a substitute for attention. Not with pity, which she would have found unbearable. With something more patient than either of those things. Observation. The look of someone who had already filed something away, and was now simply confirming what he'd noted. It was the man to his left who moved first. He was built like someone who had been designed specifically to be difficult to ignore. Broad through the chest, with dark copper skin, and a jaw sharp enough to cause problems. He wore his formal tunic with the collar open one button too many, which on anyone else would have looked careless, but on him looked like a deliberate refusal to be formal. When he smiled, it arrived on his face like it had been waiting just behind his expression for the right moment. He crossed the distance between them with the ease of a man who had never been turned away from anything in his life. "I want you to know," he said, stopping just inside the comfortable edge of her personal space, "that I agreed with everything he just said, completely, without reservation." Sadie blinked. "You were listening to my conversation?" "Everyone in a 12-foot radius was listening to your conversation. The difference is that I'm the only one honest enough to admit it." He extended a hand. "Cade, Beta Commander of the Northern Throne, and you are the most composed woman I've seen in this hall tonight, which is saying something, because I've been watching since the doors opened." She looked at his hand for a moment before taking it. His grip was warm and firm, and lasted exactly the right amount of time. "Sadie," she said. "Just Sadie? For now." He grinned like she'd said something that pleased him more than he'd expected. The second man appeared at Cade's shoulder with the energy of someone who moved through spaces the way smoke moved through cracks, without friction and without announcement. He was leaner than Cade, with lighter eyes, and the kind of face that looked like it was always on the edge of a joke it hadn't decided to share yet. He was also, Sadie noticed, watching Dorian's direction with a particular expression that had nothing friendly in it. "Finn," he said, by way of introduction, then immediately, "that man over there told you there was a misunderstanding." It wasn't a question. "You were also listening," Sadie said. "I was paying attention. There's a difference." Finn tilted his head slightly. A misunderstanding implies that one party failed to understand correctly. What happened over there was not a misunderstanding. "Would you like me to be more specific about what it actually was?" "No," she said, and was surprised to find that she almost wanted to smile. "I think I understood it well enough on my own." "She's sharp," Finn said to Cade, as though she wasn't standing directly between them. "I noticed," Cade said. "I'm right here," Sadie said. "We know," they said, nearly in unison, and there was something so genuinely unguarded about it that the tightness in her chest loosened, just slightly, for the first time all evening. Then the third man spoke. He hadn't moved from where he'd been standing. He was still near the archway, still holding the untouched cup, still carrying that particular quality of stillness that she was beginning to understand was not passivity, but its opposite. The stillness of something that had so much force behind it that it didn't need to move to make itself known. Like a fire that didn't need to reach toward you, to make you aware of its heat. "Leave her room to breathe." 4 words, quiet enough that they shouldn't have carried over the noise of the hall. But Cade and Finn both shifted back half a step, without appearing to notice they'd done it. The Alpha King, Xander, crossed the space between them at an unhurried pace, and stopped where his companions had been standing. Up close, he was not what the stories had prepared her for. The stories she had grown up hearing had described the Alpha King of the Northern Throne as something between a force of nature and a cautionary tale. the wolf who had united 6 fractured territories through a combination of strategy, strength, and a stillness that reportedly unnerved even the wolves who followed him willingly. The stories had not mentioned that he had a small scar through his left brow, or that he held himself like someone who had long ago stopped needing the approval of a room. He looked at her the way he had looked at her from across the hall. Direct, unhurried, like he had already decided she was worth looking at carefully and saw no reason to pretend otherwise. "Sadie," he said, and it was not a greeting. It was a confirmation, like he had already known and was simply choosing to say it aloud. "You know my name," she said. "I know you brought dried valerian and wound close moss to the East Garrison 3 times last winter when the pack healers were short on supplies. You never asked to be paid and you never told anyone your name. The garrison commander mentioned it in a report." A pause, brief as a breath. "I remember useful information." She stared at him. She had made those deliveries because her mother had been too ill to travel, and the garrison wolves had needed the herbs, and she had not been able to simply let that be someone else's problem. She had not thought anyone of consequence had ever known about it. "That was a small thing," she said carefully. "Small things are usually the truest ones." Behind her, at the far end of the hall, she heard Dorian's laugh rise above the crowd, easy and untroubled, already absorbed into the evening as if nothing had happened, as if she had been a minor interruption in a night that had never really included her. She felt Xander notice her attention shift in that direction, not because he followed her gaze, because something in the quality of his stillness changed, just slightly, the way a wolf's ears adjust toward a sound before the rest of the body follows. "He made you a promise," Xander said, still quiet, still level. "He changed his mind," she said. "It happens." "It does," he agreed. And then, after a moment that felt longer than it was, "It says more about the mind that changed than about the promise that was made." Sadie looked at him directly for the first time since he'd approached, and she found that he was already looking back, which should have felt invasive, and instead felt like something else entirely, like being recognized by someone who had no reason to recognize her, and choosing to do so anyway. From across the hall, she watched Lord Councillor Ashvale approach his son with a satisfied expression, watched Dorian accept a congratulatory clasp on the shoulder from an older lord, watched Mira take his arm, with the practiced ease of a woman who had known this outcome long before tonight. And she stood here, in her hand-sewn dress, between a grinning beta commander, an ironic strategist, and the most powerful alpha in the northern world, who had just told her that small things were usually the truest ones. "Why are you being kind to me?" she asked Xander, because she had spent enough of her life being surprised by kindness that she had learned to ask the question plainly, rather than waste time pretending she wasn't surprised. He considered this with the seriousness it deserved. "I'm not being kind," he said finally. "I'm being accurate." Somewhere behind her, Brea appeared at the corridor entrance with wide eyes and an expression that said she had witnessed at least the last several minutes, and was not sure if she should approach or simply stand very still and hope no one noticed her. Sadie caught her friend's eye. Brea mouthed something that looked very much like what is happening. Sadie had no answer for that yet, but for the first time since she had walked through the front doors of the great hall of Ashenvale, in a dress the color of a full moon, she did not want to leave. The night deepened around the hall like a tide coming in slowly. Torches burned lower in their iron brackets. The long tables filled with the remains of the feast, bones and bread and the dark rings left by wine cups on old oak. The noise of the gathering had settled into something more relaxed, and therefore more dangerous. The particular looseness that came when wolves had been eating and drinking for hours, and the formal ceremonies of the evening were giving way to the informal politics that were always the real reason everyone had come. Sadie had not left. She was not entirely sure how that had happened. One moment she had been standing near the corridor with every intention of walking home through the cold and spending the rest of the night pretending the evening had never occurred. The next, Kate had produced a cup of warm spiced wine from somewhere and pressed it into her hands with the energy of a man completing a necessary task. And Finn had said something quietly, cutting about the embroidery on Lord Ashvale's ceremonial tunic that had made her press her lips together to keep from laughing. And Xander had looked at her over the rim of his untouched cup with an expression that was not quite a smile, but contained all the essential elements of one. And she had stayed. Brea had been absorbed into the group with the seamless efficiency of someone who had been waiting her whole life for exactly this kind of evening. She sat now at the nearest table beside Finn, who was explaining something about pack border disputes with the animated energy of a man who found everything genuinely interesting, and Brea was listening with the careful attention she gave to things she was quietly filing away for later examination. Sadie watched her friend for a moment, and felt something warm move through her chest. Brea had grown up alongside her on the edge of Ashenvale, equally clanless, equally overlooked. She deserved a night where someone paid attention to what she said. "Your friend," Xander said from beside her. He had moved at some point from the archway to the space at her left, close enough to speak quietly without being overheard. "She's known you a long time, since we were children. Our mothers traded remedies." Sadie looked down at the wine cup in her hands. She was the first person I told about tonight, about what Dorian had promised. What did she say? Sadie considered being diplomatic about it. She didn't say anything. She went very quiet, which is what Brea does when she thinks something is going to go wrong and doesn't want to be the one to say it. She was right to be concerned. "Yes." A pause. "She usually is." Xander was quiet for a moment in the way she was beginning to recognize as characteristic of him. Not the silence of someone thinking about what to say next, but the silence of someone who was comfortable enough with the present moment not to feel the need to fill it. "How long did you know him?" he asked. "Almost a year." She said it plainly, without trying to make it sound like less than it was. He was kind in the beginning. Or he seemed kind. I think now that he was simply comfortable, and I mistook comfort for kindness, because I hadn't seen enough of either to know the difference. She felt Xander look at her. "That's an honest thing to say about yourself," he said. "It's a true thing. There's a difference." She heard her own echo of his earlier words, and glanced up to find that he had noticed it too. Something shifted briefly in his expression, too quick and too contained to name. Across the hall, the formal portion of the evening was beginning. The pack lords were moving toward the ceremonial platform at the northern end of the hall, where the claiming gathering's central ritual would take place. The formal acknowledgement of alliances, the declaration of any new bonds, the public record of who stood with whom. It was the moment the entire gathering had been built around. The moment Dorian had promised would include her. She watched him take his place near the platform with Mira at his side, and she felt the last thread of something she had been carrying for nearly a year finally release. Not painfully, just finally. Like setting down a basket you had carried so long you had forgotten it was heavy. "You should be up there," she said, nodding toward the platform. "You're the AlphaKing. They'll be expecting you." "They'll wait," Xander said, with the complete absence of concern of a man who had never once in his life needed to hurry toward anyone's expectations. "That's a very calm way to be the most powerful wolf in the room." "Power that needs to announce itself isn't power," he said. "It's performance." She looked at him. "Did you just say that to sound impressive? Or do you actually believe it?" The almost smile appeared again, and this time it lasted a fraction longer. "Both things can be true." Before she could answer, a disturbance moved through the crowd near the platform. Not loud, not violent. The specific kind of social disturbance that happened when someone said something in a voice slightly too large for the space, and the words spread outward through the room like rings on still water. Lord Councillor Ashvale's voice, rounded with wine and satisfaction, carrying further than he likely intended. Finest match the family could have made. Dorian had the sense to see it in the end. That other business, the healer's girl, was never serious. A passing kindness. You know how young men are. A passing kindness. Sadie stood very still. She did not turn toward the sound. She did not change her expression. She had spent years learning how to receive small humiliations quietly, because making a scene had never been a luxury available to a woman without a clan, without a name, without anyone powerful enough to stand behind her. But her hands tightened on the wine cup. Xander had gone very still beside her. It was a different quality of stillness than before. Before it had been the stillness of water. Now it was the stillness of something beneath water, something with weight and direction, waiting. Sadie, he said quietly. I'm fine, she said, which was partially true. I know you are, he said. That's not what I was going to say. She looked at him. I was going to ask, he said, with the same unhurried calm he brought to everything, if you would walk with me to the platform. The hall seemed to breathe differently for a moment. Why, she said carefully, would you ask me that? Because I am going to stand up there in approximately 4 minutes and make several formal declarations in front of every pack lord in the Northern and Eastern Territories. He looked at her with those steady winterbark eyes. And I would prefer to walk there with you beside me rather than leaving you standing here alone, while a man who doesn't deserve the floor space describes you as a passing kindness. The silence between them was different from the silences before. It had weight to it now. Shape. You barely know me, she said. I know you brought medicine to wolves who needed it and never asked for recognition. I know you spent 3 weeks making a dress for a night that disappointed you, and you still haven't let it break your posture. I know that in the last hour you've been funnier and sharper and more honestly spoken than anyone else in this hall. A pause. I know enough. From the table nearby, Brea had gone completely silent. Finn had also stopped talking, which was apparently a rare enough event that Cade was looking at him with mild alarm. Sadie looked down at the wine cup in her hands, at the dress she had made stitch by careful stitch, at the floor of the great hall of Ashenvale, which she had only ever entered through the back door. She thought about Dorian's voice saying misunderstanding like it was a door he could simply close. She thought about Lord Ashvale saying passing kindness to a room full of people who would believe him because he had a name and she didn't. She thought about Xander saying small things are usually the truest ones. She set the wine cup down on the nearest surface with a steadiness that surprised her. All right, she said. She watched something move through his eyes. Not triumph, not satisfaction. Something quieter than either of those things. Something that looked almost like relief, as though he had been waiting for this answer longer than the last 4 minutes. He offered his arm. She took it, and they walked together toward the platform at the northern end of the great hall, through the parting crowd, past the pack lords and the beta officers and the ladies in their imported lace, past Dorian, who turned at the sound of the shifting crowd and went very still when he saw who was walking and who was walking beside whom. Sadie did not look at him. She kept her chin level, her hand steady on Xander's arm, and she walked toward the platform like a woman who had always been heading there, who had simply taken the long way around. Behind her, she heard Brea make a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sob, but contained everything essential from both. The platform was 3 steps above the hall floor, which was enough to be seen by everyone. Enough that when Sadie climbed those 3 steps beside the Alpha King of the Northern Throne, there was not a single wolf in the great hall of Ashenvale who could pretend they hadn't noticed. The pack lords arranged near the platform were the first to adjust. It happened in that particular sequence she was beginning to recognize. First the bodies, shoulders squaring, chins lifting, the instinctive physical recalibration of wolves in the presence of dominant authority. Then the eyes, moving from Xander to her and back again with the controlled urgency of people trying to understand something quickly without appearing to try. Then the voices, dropping to undertones that spread through the hall like wind moving through dry grass. Sadie kept her hand on Xander's arm and kept her breathing even. Lord Councillor Ashvale had gone the color of old ash. She noticed it without looking directly at him, the way you noticed a fire going out in your peripheral vision. He was standing 12 feet to the left of the platform, with his wine cup forgotten in his hand, and an expression that suggested he was rapidly reassessing several decisions he had made this evening and finding all of them wanting. Dorian stood beside his father. She allowed herself one glance. Just one. Because she was human enough to need it, and honest enough to admit that to herself. He was looking at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before. It was not regret exactly, or not only regret. It was the specific look of a man who had been certain of the value of something, had set it aside, and was now watching someone else recognize what he had failed to see. She looked away. Xander stepped forward to the speaking position at the center of the platform, and the hall settled into the particular attentive silence that gathered around him naturally, without demand or ceremony. "Lords and ladies of the northern and eastern packs," he said, and his voice carried without effort, the way certain voices did when the body behind them had never needed to strain to be heard. "I'll keep the formal declarations brief, because most of what matters tonight has already been said in smaller conversations, and those are always the ones that count." A murmur of appreciation moved through the older lords. Xander had a reputation for dispensing with ceremony that made men who loved ceremony nervous, and men who loved efficiency deeply grateful. He spoke for several minutes about the alliance confirmations, the border agreements, the formal acknowledgments between packs that were the official business of the claiming gathering. Sadie stood slightly behind his left shoulder, where he had placed her when they reached the platform, close enough that her presence was unambiguous, but not positioned in a way that demanded anything of her before she was ready. It was a careful thing to do. She noticed it. When the formal declarations were nearly complete, Xander paused in the way he paused before saying something he had already decided mattered. "One additional matter," he said. "Informal, but worth stating in front of witnesses." The hall was very quiet. "There is a woman standing on this platform who has served the wolves of the Eastern Garrison with consistent, unclaimed generosity for the past 2 winters. She has no pack name. She has no Lord's crest. She has, by the standards this gathering tends to use, no formal standing in this room." He let that settle for exactly the right amount of time. "I'd like to correct that." Sadie stopped breathing for a moment. "As of tonight, Sadie of Ashenvale is formally recognized under the protection of the Northern Throne. Any pack that wishes to dispute that recognition is welcome to bring that dispute to me directly." No one moved. No one spoke. Lord Councillor Ashvale looked like a man who had swallowed something that disagreed with him profoundly and was attempting to do so gracefully. Dorian had gone very still. From somewhere in the middle of the hall, Sadie heard a sound she recognized. Brea, failing to entirely suppress something that had started as a sharp breath and was becoming, quietly and with great feeling, tears. Beside her, Finn had apparently decided that this was a moment that called for a long drink of wine. Cade was grinning with the open satisfaction of a man who had known how this was going to end and had been looking forward to it. Xander turned to look at her, and his expression in that private half-second before he returned his attention to the room was not the expression of a man who had just made a political declaration. It was the expression of a man checking to make sure the person he had made it for was all right. She gave him the smallest nod she could manage. Something in his shoulders settled. The formal portion of the evening ended shortly after. The hall returned to its looser, later night rhythm, but the texture of it had changed. People moved differently around Sadie now. Not with the exaggerated deference they showed Xander, but with the adjusted awareness of people who had recalibrated someone's position in their internal map of who mattered. Lords who had not looked at her 2 hours ago now inclined their heads slightly when they passed. Ladies who had moved around her like she was furniture now met her eyes. It was disorienting in a way she hadn't expected. Not unpleasant. Just new. The way all true changes felt new, slightly too large for the shape of the life you'd been living before them. She was standing near the tall window at the eastern wall, looking out at the dark courtyard and the tree line beyond, when she heard footsteps behind her that she recognized already, which said something about how quickly she had learned the particular quality of his approach. "You didn't tell me you were going to do that," she said without turning around. "No," Xander agreed, stopping beside her. "You could have asked me first." "If I had asked you first, you would have said it was unnecessary." She turned to look at him. "It was unnecessary." "It was accurate," he said, which was the second time he had used that word in place of kindness, and she was beginning to understand that for him, they were not different things. She looked back out at the courtyard. The moon was high and full, pouring white light across the stone below, and somewhere beyond the tree line, a wolf was running. She could hear it, the distant soft percussion of something moving freely through the dark. "Why does it matter to you?" she said quietly. "What happens to me?" He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then, "Do you want the practical answer or the true one? Are they different?" "The practical answer is that wolves who give without asking for recognition are rare and worth protecting." A pause. "The true answer is that I noticed you 8 months ago, in the East Garrison courtyard, in the rain, refusing payment from a beta officer who was trying to give you his own ration money because he had nothing else to offer. You told him to keep it, and walked home in the rain and didn't look back once." She stared at him. "You were there," she said. "I was passing through on inspection. You didn't see me. And you remembered that. I told you. I remember useful information." He looked at her steadily. "I also remember things that aren't useful but that I find I can't set aside." The moon was very bright on the courtyard stones. Sadie thought about 8 months of not knowing she had been seen. 8 months of Dorian's comfortable warmth and easy promises, and the way he had said misunderstanding like a door closing. 8 months of making herself smaller, so she would fit into a life that had never actually been built to hold her. "Xander," she said, and his name felt different in her mouth than other names, like it had more substance, like it required more of her to say. He looked at her. "When you said that tonight," she said carefully, the words she had been carrying since the moment she first heard them, the words that had stopped her feet in the middle of the hall, that whoever ended up with me would be lucky. She held his gaze. "I was hoping you meant yourself." The silence that followed was not empty. It was the fullest silence she had ever stood inside, full of the torch warmth from the hall behind them, and the cold coming off the window glass, and the distant sound of the wolf running through the dark, beyond the trees, and the particular quality of a man who was choosing, carefully and completely, what to say next. "I did," he said. 2 words, quiet as everything he said, certain as everything he meant. Sadie felt something move through her chest that was not the crack of winter branches, but their opposite, the particular feeling of something that had been cold for a very long time beginning, carefully and with great intention, to thaw. From somewhere behind them, Cade's voice drifted across the hall with cheerful indiscretion. "Finn, I believe that's what winning looks like." "I know what winning looks like," Finn said. "I'm choosing to observe it quietly and with dignity." "You've had 4 cups of wine." "Dignified wine." Sadie laughed. It came out before she could decide whether to let it, real and unguarded, and she felt Xander go very still beside her, the way a man went still when something surprised him into attention. When she looked at him, he was watching her with an expression she hadn't seen on him yet, open in a way the rest of his face rarely was, like a window in a stone wall that nobody had thought to put there, but that let in more light than all the torches combined. "You should do that more," he said. "Laugh at your friends." "Just that," he said. "Exactly that." 3 months later, The northern throne smelled like pine and wood smoke, and something Sadie had taken a long time to name. She had finally decided it smelled like permanence, like a place that had been standing long enough to stop trying to prove it would continue standing. The great stone corridors of Xander's Keep had that quality. Walls 4 feet thick, floors worn smooth by generations of wolves who had walked the same paths. Windows cut deep into the rock that framed the mountain valley below, like paintings someone had decided the world deserved. She had arrived in autumn, when the trees below the keep were burning red and gold. She was still here in winter, when snow covered everything and the wolves of the northern throne ran the ridgelines at dusk in a long, dark line that she watched from the eastern tower window, with a cup of tea warming her hands and something settled and certain in her chest. She belonged here. It had taken her approximately 2 weeks to understand that, and another week to stop being frightened by how completely she believed it. The pack had not accepted her immediately. She had not expected them to. There had been questions, careful and formal from the senior lords, less careful and less formal from the younger wolves who had not yet learned to disguise their skepticism as protocol. A woman without a clan, without a pack name, without a lineage anyone could point to in the record books. Xander had not defended her to them. He had told her that clearly, and without apology, on her 3rd day at the keep. "If I defend you, it becomes about me," he had said. "You don't need my defense. You need the opportunity to be seen clearly. Those are different things." She had understood. She had also spent the following 6 weeks being seen as clearly as she could manage. She learned the keep. She learned the wolves, their names and their histories, and the particular dynamics of a pack that had been built by a man who valued competence over bloodline. She helped in the healer's quarters when the winter sickness moved through the lower garrison, because that was what she knew how to do, and because need did not wait for anyone to finish establishing their social position. She sat at the long table in the great hall for meals and listened more than she spoke, and when she spoke she said true things. Slowly, with the particular pace of wolves who trusted their own judgment above all else, the pack began to see her. Not as Xander's choice, though she was that, as herself. Cade had been her ally from the beginning, which she suspected was partly genuine affection, and partly because he found the entire situation entertaining and had decided to be useful about it. Finn had been more measured, watching her the way he watched everything, with the patient attention of someone assembling a complete picture before drawing conclusions. When he finally told her, 6 weeks in, that he thought she was exactly what the Northern Throne had been missing without knowing it, she understood it was the highest compliment he was capable of offering, and received it accordingly. Brea had come north with her. That had not been a question. Sadie had told her she was going, and Brea had looked at her for a long moment, with the expression she wore when she was not going to say, "I told you so," even though she had, in her quiet way, told her so, and then had begun packing. Brea was now working with the Keep's healers in a capacity that used her actual skills for the first time in her life, and had recently been observed in animated conversation with a quiet, serious wolf from the eastern garrison who had apparently been assigned to accompany the healers on their winter rounds, and had made the mistake of expressing an opinion about medicinal herb preparation in Brea's presence. Sadie had decided not to interfere. Dorian came once. It was 6 weeks after the claiming gathering, on a gray afternoon when the first real snow of the season was beginning to fall. He arrived formally, with his father's colors, and a letter of introduction that Cade received at the gate, with an expression of polite neutrality that Sadie recognized as the face he wore when he was actively choosing not to say something. She was in the healer's courtyard when Cade found her. "He's asking to speak with you," Cade said. "Xander knows he's here. The decision is yours." She thought about it for exactly as long as it deserved. "All right," she said. They met in one of the smaller receiving rooms, stone walls and a single window, and a fire that had been burning long enough to have done its job. Dorian looked like himself, which was to say he looked like a man who was accustomed to rooms receiving him well, and was not entirely certain this one would. He stood when she entered. "Sadie," he said. "Dorian." He looked at her for a moment, with that expression she had seen at the claiming gathering, the one that contained regret, and something more complicated than regret. "I wanted to say," he began, and then stopped, and she could see him choosing between the version of this conversation that made him feel better and the version that was actually honest. To his credit, he chose the honest one. "I handled things badly. What I said that night, the way I said it wasn't worthy of what you deserved. I knew it wasn't, even then." "Why did you do it anyway?" she asked. Not with anger, with genuine curiosity, because she had spent some time wondering and had decided she was allowed to know. He was quiet for a moment. "Because it was easier, and because I told myself that easier meant smarter, and I was wrong about that." She nodded slowly. "I appreciate you saying so," she said, and she meant it, which surprised her a little. The part of her that had been carrying his name for a year had already put it down, somewhere between the claiming gathering and the first morning she had woken up in the Northern Throne, and felt, without deciding to feel it, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. There was nothing left in her that needed his apology in order to be whole. But she was glad he had given it anyway. It said something about him that he had come. Not enough to change what had happened, but something. "Be well, Dorian," she said, and she meant that too. He left before the snow got heavy. Xander found her that evening in the Eastern Tower, which had become her favorite place in the keep, without either of them making a formal decision about it. He stood beside her at the window and looked out at the white valley below, where the snow was still falling in the slow, deliberate way it fell when it intended to keep falling for a long time. "How was it?" he asked. "Easier than I expected," she said. "Cleaner." He nodded, the way he nodded when something confirmed what he had already suspected. "Xander," she said. "Yes." She turned to look at him. This man who had remembered her in the rain 8 months before she knew he existed, who had walked her to a platform and given her name to a room full of people who needed to hear it, who had told her that small things were usually the truest ones, and proven it consistently in every small thing he had done since. "I want to stay," she said. "Not because you offered protection, and not because this is better than what I had before. Because this is where I choose to be. Because you are who I choose." He looked at her for a long moment with those steady winter bark eyes that had seen her clearly from the beginning, before she had known she was being seen. "I know," he said. "I've been waiting for you to say it without any of it being about him." She understood what he meant. He had been waiting for her to arrive at this choice from herself. Not from gratitude, not from the shadow of Dorian's rejection, not from the dazzle of a night that had changed everything. Just from her own certainty, standing on its own ground. "It isn't about him," she said. "It hasn't been for a long time." He reached out and took her hand, and the simplicity of it, no ceremony, no performance, just his hand and hers in the firelight of the Eastern Tower while snow fell on the valley below, was so completely right that she felt it settle into her, like the keep's walls had settled into the mountain. Like something that had been finding its place for a long time and had finally, completely, arrived. "Then stay," he said. She did. In the spring, the pack gathered in the great hall not for ceremony, but for the simple fact of being together. Long tables full of wolves who had become, over a winter's worth of shared cold and shared work and shared meals, something that felt to Sadie less like a pack she had joined, and more like a truth she had always been moving toward. Brea sat across the table with color in her cheeks, and the particular expression of a woman who had stopped waiting for her life to begin, and was now simply living it. The serious wolf from the garrison sat beside her, with the focused attention of a man who had found something worth paying attention to. Cade was in the middle of a story that kept getting louder. Finn was pretending not to be entertained and failing. The younger wolves were arguing cheerfully about something that had nothing to do with hierarchy or status or who belonged where. Xander sat beside Sadie at the head of the table, close enough that their shoulders touched, and she felt him there the way she felt the walls of the keep, the way she felt the mountains outside the window, as something solid and chosen and permanent. She thought about a cold cottage and a hand-sewn dress and a promise that had broken cleanly in the great hall of Ashenvale. She thought about 3 steps up to a platform and a voice saying, "I'd like to correct that." She thought about a window and moonlight and 2 words spoken quietly and with absolute certainty. "I did." She looked at Xander. He was already looking at her, the way she had come to understand he often was when she thought he wasn't, with that steady, open attention that had never once made her feel watched and had always made her feel seen. "What?" she said quietly. "Nothing," he said. "Everything." She took his hand under the table where no one could see it, which meant it was only for them, which meant it was the truest kind. Outside the keep, the spring valley was green and wide and full of the sound of wolves running free under an open sky. Inside, Sadie was exactly where she had chosen to be, and that was the whole of it, and it was enough, and it was everything, and it was done.